Councillor Lee. Councillor Fletcher, please.
I feel a bit of disappointment that a year ago we were told Council's financial situation was sustainable and we were encouraged to take the government's Three Waters sweetener. Who's going to turn down free money, I recall an elected member saying. Well, in my life, there's no free lunch, and sooner or later there'll be strings, and it seems that those funds were just papering over a deep crack. In the intervening months, we have seen interest rates rise, we have had the tragedy associated with the anniversary floods, and we know the tremendous difficulties, but they are not solely responsible for the underlying and systemic problems we want and need to address today. Since the formation of the super city, debt has continued to accumulate. Those who voted against us, and I'm thinking especially of the late Dick Quacks, they foreshadowed the situation we are in. We failed to prioritise, didn't give sufficient consideration to intergenerational debt, and we weren't prudent. We've left a legacy of debt and fear. The real issue here in the debate should be how we tackle expenditure, not just selling assets. We know we need to own this and move forward together. I want to say how much I have truly appreciated meeting with other councillors over the last couple of days. Meeting without officers present, or the Mayor, thrashing out how we might proceed. It has been civil, constructive, there haven't been recriminations and name-calling. Everyone had the common objective of good stewardship for Auckland with a determination to do the right thing, and I particularly want to thank Shane Henderson for his chocolate biscuits, which were very, very welcome. So in moving forward, I want your worship to also thank a few other people. I want, as others have mentioned, to thank John Crawford. He is a former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, I should say. I would like to really thank him for his constructive, clear and contestable advice freely given. I think he might be here today. I also wish to thank my CSA Alex and Andrew Pickering for their support. And I want to thank Max Hardy for taking my many phone calls in confidence and working towards us being here today free to speak, I hope with open minds. I am grateful for being a member of the Audit and Risk Committee this term. I think the request for disclosure of the debt situation is something I wished had been in place a long time ago. So in the interest of being constructive and not wishing to be a drongo, financially illiterate or a dipshit, I welcome the opportunity to safely express our preferences. Your worship, many voted for you because they believed that Auckland was on the wrong track and we needed a disruptor. And that is why the support you got in December was unprecedented for the near unanimous support for going out for consultation. That is not something your predecessors had enjoyed. Most of you know I don't want to sell the airport shares now. Anything of that magnitude, as you've heard from time and time again, should be on the table along with everything else during the LTP. And I would like to see an untouchable fund, a bit like the old Infrastructure Auckland, yielding positive dividends, because I think that's what we need. Selling shares now, just because of the debt situation, does not sit comfortably with me. But I know we need to land a budget today in order to give Auckland a certainty. In that spirit, I'm willing to see, as Councillor Darby has suggested, a small holding sold, if it means that we can make progress and get towards the LTP. So I wish for us to take some decisions today, and it does involve dead rats, as others have said, but we've got to come together before the LTP, which needs a change in culture in itself. How about we all sit down with our officers and work out our brief for what we want from the LTP before our diaries are littered with appointments for briefings that we are going to have. There are a few things that we could look at doing differently because we should be acting as governors. So today is the curtain raiser for the LTP. John Watson has spoken, I think, on behalf of many of us for the need for protecting funds from present and future spendthrifts. But continuing to flog off assets ultimately just defers the day of judgment and isn't fair to the people of Auckland. The decisions that we have taken on visionary projects and the building of new assets is to be celebrated. Time will be kind to this council for advancing the CRL and our regional parks, but history will not record us well if we fail to prioritise and address our inability to live within our means.
Thank you for that. Councillor Newman, please.
Yeah, look, thank you, Your Worship. My first preference would have been the proposed revised budget, which includes the divestment of the shares. There were conditions for that. I'm just not sure that's going to get up at the moment, so I think that we might be having to talk compromises very shortly. I just want to describe what I think a prudent budget looks like. Firstly, it has prudential budget settings, which starts with fully funding depreciation. Very important. Secondly, there needs to be some de-risking of debt. It's not just about the debt ceiling, it's about the cost of servicing the debt. I'm interested in what is the cost of servicing the debt. Look, I agree with Councillor Hills. A real concern for me has been the social licence of this budget, which is about the range of services to the community. That is very important. Look, the funding contract for COB by way of example. When I first came to this place, getting a fair funding arrangement for Bureau in my ward, Manaroa and Papakura, was very important. The cost of that overall was higher because the agreement for getting those Bureau properly funded was a no disadvantage clause, which meant that there couldn't be an adjustment to the other bureaus. So yeah, we do have costs. They are costs which are inconvenient for some, but that is important for me. That has to be paid for. Throughout this whole discussion, the best advocate for my ward has been Matt Winiata. I'm very grateful for his advocacy on the budget, and I'm very grateful that the revised budget reflects a different approach to cuts. And I know that Matt is listening to this. He's been messaging me throughout, and I appreciate his advocacy. He's got a big future in our ward. Councillor Fury, I very much appreciate your reflection on history with respect to Manukau City's shareholding. Thanks for that. I was part of that debate. We spent money to get an increase in the shareholding for the airport. And Councillor Darby, you will rightly question as to what is the motive. It's a good question to ask. The motive at the time was to block a takeover bid. Now, whatever the pros and cons of that, that's what I went along with that. I have to say though, if I'm honest with you, that my priority, being elected public office, has never been about developing an airport precinct. My priority has always been about trying to develop facilities for the betterment of my constituents in South Auckland. And that's why, at the time that the priority for me, redeveloping Netball Manaroa, the Manaroa Sports Centre, these were things that were important to me and they got done. Councillor Bartley, you've indicated that there are communities out there that are having to seek external funding. You are absolutely right. That is what's happening. And I've been doing that in my ward. Facilities such as Manaroa Methodist, Hallmai Bowls, Papakura City FC at McLennan Park, Manukau Cricket, Manaroa Tennis, etc., etc. I would like to have criteria for divestment which starts to address some of these gaps that have lingered for years that I was never able to get Gough to move on. And that's why, Councillor Filipaina, I most certainly want to see a return for the legacy communities of the communities of legacy Auckland City and Manukau City. And that's why Memorial Park is there, because I want to get on with that. Because at the moment, the the council isn't an equal partner, and I want to address that. It might not be an acceptable condition for some people, but it's an important consideration for me. And thank you, Your Worship, for allowing me to take up those particular matters with your office in discussion. I just want to conclude, if I may, by saying that I believe that with respect to this particular budget, this isn't a circuit breaker, I accept that, and there will need to be a series of budgets as we go through the long-term plan. We have not funded the cost of CRL. We have not funded the enormous burden of unfunded depreciation. We have not funded the cost of storm recovery and the increasing cost of debt servicing. And I want to know what those costs will be as soon as possible, because that has to be paid for. I look forward to the debate, but you asked for my initial position, that's it.
Thank you for that. Very clear. Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to everybody. I've listened to everything everyone's had to say, and I want to support my fellow West Waitakere Ward Councillor for his good words. Lots of people have touched on it, but I haven't heard the word productivity used. There was no productivity lever. We aren't in a strapped for cash situation, we're in a productivity deficit. And that's not our workers not doing their job properly, that's us guys voting through policies and processes which load admin on their backs. We've got structure which lines up our workforce horizontally on each other's back rather than vertically across the public-facing coalface to delivering services. You see it out in the suburbs, everybody sees it every day, where it takes now 5 people to pick up rubbish on the footpath or 7 people to unblock one manhole. And that's why people in my ward, you know, there's for and against for selling the airport shares, but when you talk to everybody in behind it all, they don't believe that they're going to get anything for the loss of the shares. And in some ways, I agree with them. I don't see why we need to use a $2 billion cork to plug a $350 million hole. There's an old saying that my dad and grandpa used to say, keep your powder dry. Why use up all our powder in an elephant gun to shoot a rat so we can get to the real problem, the long-term plan? So I want us to go forward in a nice, sensible, structured way where we walk towards the main problem, which is our productivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Fury, please.
Thank you. I don't have a polished speech, and to be honest, I thought Ken might go a little bit longer. So, yeah. No offence, Ken.
Flexibility is an advantage.
So, noting that this is in the context of an open workshop, that we're giving our views at this point, but reserving the right to debate, seek amendment, etc. The original question from the Mayor for this discussion was what our ideal budget would be. And much like my colleague from the East, Councillor Williamson, I wouldn't start from here to deliver my ideal budget, which would be based on investing in Auckland and in Aucklanders. However, we are where we are, and keeping in mind the 4 levers and the feedback that we've had from the community, and acknowledging, I've had 2 of my colleagues already mention this, Councillor Hills and Councillor Henderson, I have been interested in how we close the gap sustainably over time and in an enduring way, and I think the most responsible and honest way to do that is through a larger rates increase. And I know that that's not got support around the table, so I won't be putting that up today, but if someone else wanted to, I would probably support that. In regard to the cuts, I kind of don't see them as, well, I don't see that activity as a negative. I see it very much as a positive. It is something that delivers for our community. We're talking about services that directly impact and often directly impact the parts of our community that are most vulnerable and who we most need to support from an equity lens. I'm not scared of debt because we use debt to fund capital investments, to spread the burden of paying for those investments over the generations who will benefit from those investments. And I see that as the appropriate way to use debt as much as possible. I worry that using debt when we have other options, which would be a higher rates increase, to fund an OPEX gap isn't actually an equitable response because it doesn't spread the burden across generations of generational assets. It funds in the short term some services that actually cannot be benefits across a longer term time frame, as debt should be used. I've received many, many emails, and I want to acknowledge the people who've written to me as much as possible. I have replied. In the last few days, you've probably got an auto-reply because things have got a little bit out of hand. I have had a lot of people tell me that they want me to support retaining the airport shares. And I've listened very carefully to that, and I'm still thinking about it. As some people may be aware, the last couple of days I've had other aspects of the airport share decision on my mind. That's now resolved. But I do want to acknowledge that the airport shares are not just a straightforward asset for us as a city. They have in the past produced income. They will again in the future, probably in the near future. And the last 3 years is something of an aberration in that regard. So I sort of put that aspect of it to one side. At my core, I did not run for local government to support the sale of public assets. And that for me is probably where I go when it comes to the airport shares. But I will continue to listen to the debate and see where we land. I wanted to touch though on what I think the real problem is, which is revenue. And that's where I come back to rates, but also other forms of revenue. And we do need to look at our car parking revenue in particular and acknowledge that that work is going to happen and hopefully we can see some improvement there before we get to the long-term plan. But what I really want us to do in the long-term plan is really thoroughly look at our income. What are our options? Are we getting as much income as we could? And how can we manage that better in the future? Because we can't keep making cuts. We're actually delivering now a level of service to Aucklanders that is actually pretty good in most areas and that they tell us they want and that they frankly deserve. And we need to take responsible decisions about bringing in the income that will fund that level of service that Aucklanders tell us they want and need. And for me, that's not through short-term debt and it's not through selling the airport shares. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councilor Leone, please.
Kia ora koutou. Today we're making the difficult decision to balance the budget hole we've been presented with. This could arguably be one of the most significant budget decisions that will be made since the Super City was amalgamated. I agree with the comments made earlier by Councillor Dalton. Our communities have been significantly impacted and stressed, thinking they will lose arts centres, funding for swimming programs for months. So I want to acknowledge the significant levels of stress they have been under and the local board chairs and members that are here present today. Kia ora. Since the budget proposal came out, I've had huge concerns with what was put on the chopping block, but agreed at the time for this to go out for consultation. I want to thank the many faux constituents who have sent hundreds of emails to save the things that are important to Aucklanders, the arts, citizens' advice bureaus, ECEs and local boards. I'm constantly reminded of the Act, which states the four well-beings and the obligation we have to ensure this is met. So I do agree with the many changes that the Mayor has made to the budget with the support of councillors since the original budget came out. I agree with this budget, except for the sale of the airport shares, either partial or full, and the ECE funding. Selling the airport shares should be the absolute last resort, and therefore I'm proposing we look at a small amount of additional debt in addition to the Mayor's proposal of 100 million, until such time we look at all options. This is not the right time to look at one of our most significant assets we have, especially when we know the shares are predicted for a $40 million dividend this year. The value of the shares since our proposal went out continue to increase. There are a number of other assets we should consider selling in the long-term plan. Discussions which I brought up in our workshops, along with the golf courses and the many other assets, additional revenue, including discussions around depreciation and capital projects. After discussions with experienced financial advisors, I've been informed we could go above our debt ceiling as long as we have a clear plan to address this within a clear time frame. Therefore, again, I agree with the Mayor's proposal of the 100 million with an additional 60 million, or the alternative of going up to 140 and increase the rates by an additional % for 20 million. I agree that we've had to cut back and will need to continue to cut back next year, given our costs outweigh our revenue and inflation. But that in-depth discussion should be in the LTP, where we can discuss all options along with the sale of the airport shares. I really don't think that a partial sale at this point in time is really going to be worth it. I'll end my kōrero with the whakatauki. He aha te mea o nui, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Think about our future generations here in Tamaki Makaurau. Kia ora.
Thank you for that. And last but certainly not least, the Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, Auckland deserve a budget that doesn't hurt too much, and that's for ratepayers, both residential and business, and for those residents who use the services we provide. We are in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and one that we have not experienced at this magnitude almost since the global financial crisis. Inflation has had an enormous impact on council costs. We have contracts linked to inflation, and materials and costs have risen dramatically. The Reserve Bank's interest rate rises are increasing payments on our unhedged debt. We've heard extensively from staff about this. So we always knew there was going to be a challenge ahead of us after last year's budget, but external circumstances, including weather events, conspired to make it much worse than we ever expected. Your Worship, your budget pushes the limits in some areas, but in doing so brings back some of the cuts that Aucklanders have told us that they were so passionate about. I'm going to start with the first one, the rates lever. You've increased rates from your initial proposal to over 2% to 6.7%, which is pretty much at inflation. That, of course, is for the residential ratepayer on top of the increases that they have to pay for food, for public transport. Remember, those full fares are going back, so if you're on a 2-stage fare bus trip and you're 2 people in a family that go to work every day, 48 weeks a year, 5 days a week, that's about 2,000. That will double to 4,000 just to pay for your public transport. You've got mortgages that have gone up. 38% of the cost of living or the CPI increase is based on that mortgage increase. You've got the increase of costs for water. So whatever we settle on for a rates rise is on top of all those other things, and it just exacerbates the cost. And from my opinion, I think we need to be mindful of the cost struggles for working Aucklanders on fixed income. But I also think we need to be mindful of the poor business ratepayer as too, because your proposal puts that rates rise at 8.13%. And 92% of all businesses in Auckland have fewer than 10 employees. And we need to support these people who are struggling so much after the tough years of COVID. So I think you've actually settled on pretty much as good as it gets considering. And I don't want to go too high on that because I'm very conscious of the impact for both the residential and the business ratepayer. On debt, I think your debt is prudent, it's been extended, but it keeps that headroom we know we so desperately need for the likes of the CRL and the housing buyback scheme, and also it minimises the impact for ratepayers that would occur if that debt got too expensive. On your cuts, originally I thought they were awful, just saying, but you've put back those things which Aucklanders have so passionately told you that they are keen, and I really acknowledge you listening to Aucklanders around that and myself. CAB, arts and culture, local board funding, they're really important to Aucklanders, and you've put those back and you've left them there. On savings, you've locked in $83 million of permanent savings, and I congratulate you on that. But of course, how do you pay for all that? How do you pay for keeping rates affordable, or as affordable as possible? How do you pay for keeping the debt as low as it can be, knowing we need that extra headroom? How do you pay for returning some of those cuts that Aucklanders so desperately wanted? How do you pay for locking in the savings? Ultimately, we have an option, and that option is the airport shares, which simply put, financially, the cost of holding them exceeds the cost, the benefits. So finally, after over 80 hours and 29 workshops, we still have a range of views. So I feel for you desperately. We've talked this through so much. And it's going to be a hard task then to balance a budget that is fair for Aucklanders and meets the needs and desires of all those around the table. So it's over to you, Your Worship.
Well, thank you very much for that, Deputy Mayor, and thank you for all your contributions. It's informed me and each other about where we sit. We have sat here for months considering this, and we still have a range of options, of opinions. I'm going to stop this workshop now, and I'm going to have a 40-minute break while I consider the inputs that I have heard and consider whether or not any changes are required to the budget which I've put up. And when I return, we will re-enter the main board meeting, council meeting, and I will present the latest budget. I think someone here said at times like these you need a Kit Kat. I don't need chocolate. Someone else can have a sugar fix. And so I will present the latest iteration of a moving feast, but it will be informed by all the viewpoints which I've heard around the table, some of which are completely contradictory to others, but we do have to somehow or other, before we end this meeting, even whether it's today or tomorrow or next week, we still have to produce a balanced budget. We don't have the option of a government of just printing more money. We have to have a balanced budget. So thank you very much. We will reconvene at... It's 20 minutes.
Sorry, Your Worship. Sorry, look, I just wanted, process-wise, Your Worship,
Yes.
what happens with the amendments that people have? So is...
Well, the amendment process will
Will
be...
that be done in the open agenda when we come back?
When we come back to the meeting,
Kia ora, thank you.
I will present a budget, and it will be offered, and we will have questions, then we will have discussions, and that stage there people can present alternatives. Okay, so not during questions, but I will be strictly adhering to the rules. You have 40 minutes to write down and present whatever it is that you want to change and sign it. So it's not a rush. You've got plenty of time.
Got it?
So we're going to reconvene at 2 o'clock.
No.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.